Dr. Rajesh Verma had spent 15 years studying the architectural patterns of Dravidian temples across South India, but nothing prepared him for what lay beneath Kailashnath Temple in the remote hills of Karnataka. The temple, still active with daily prayers and rituals, had been built in the 9th century on foundations far older, perhaps dating back to the Chalukya dynasty or beyond. When a monsoon landslide exposed an unusual stone archway beneath the temple's eastern foundation, local priests approached Rajesh with an unexpected offer. They would allow him a single expedition beneath their sacred ground, but only if he could prove the chamber held historical rather than spiritual significance. The team assembled in New Delhi felt the weight of this responsibility. Alongside Rajesh were his estranged brother Arjun, a structural engineer with a reputation for taking risks, Priya, an epigrapher specializing in ancient inscriptions, and Marcus, a British archaeologist whose presence alone sparked tension among the local communities. They had 3 weeks to document whatever lay beneath the temple before the monsoon season made access impossible. What none of them anticipated was that some secrets were meant to stay buried, not by curse or magic, but by the deliberate hands of those who understood their explosive historical implications. From the moment they descended into darkness, watched by unseen eyes, they were no longer simply excavating history. They were unearthing a conflict that had never truly been resolved. Chapter 1. The landslide. The monsoon had been relentless. For 6 weeks, rain hammered the Western Ghats with the fury of ancient gods, and the earth, saturated and weakened, began to slip. Rajesh Verma stood at the edge of the exposed scar on Kailashnath Temple's eastern flank, his waterproof notebook already soggy, and felt the tremor of recognition that defined every archaeologist's life, the moment when the earth offers up what it has guarded for centuries. The stone archway was unmistakable. Carved from basalt, weathered but intact, it bore the hallmarks of construction techniques from the Chalukya period, yet something about its proportions suggested even greater antiquity. Intricate geometric patterns framed the opening, and beneath them, barely legible after 1,000 years of erosion, ran a line of script that made Priya's breath catch when she examined it through her magnifying glass. "This isn't Sanskrit," she whispered. "Look at the character formation. This is older, pre-Chalukya, possibly Kadamba script." The temple's head priest, an elderly man named Swami Ananda, stood beneath an umbrella held by an acolyte, watching them with an expression that wavered between curiosity and concern. He had authorized this examination only after Rajesh promised that no artifacts would be removed, no rituals disturbed, and no photographs of the chamber's interior would be distributed without explicit permission. The temple still functioned. Nearly 100 devotees came here daily. The chamber beneath their feet was not an archaeological site to them, it was part of their spiritual foundation. "The water damage suggests this was sealed deliberately," Marcus observed, kneeling to inspect the soil around the archway. "Look here. These stone wedges are tool marks, not natural erosion. Someone blocked this entrance and wanted it to stay blocked." Arjun crouched beside him, his engineer's eye catching details others missed. "The seal is sophisticated. They used friction and weight, not mortar. No adhesive to deteriorate. This was built to last through centuries of flooding, earthquakes, monsoons. Whoever did this didn't expect it to be opened again." That night, in the village guest house, the team gathered around sketches and photographs. The rain continued outside, drumming against the old tile roof with hypnotic persistence. Rajesh spread his preliminary drawings across the wooden table, and Arjun traced the architectural signatures with his finger. "The style is transitional," Rajesh said quietly. "The decorative elements on the archway, they're Kadamba, possibly 6th or 7th century, but the foundation stones are much older. Look at the wear patterns. These stones have been exposed to weathering for centuries before the temple was built above them. Someone built something here, Priya added, her voice thin with excitement and apprehension. Long before Kailashnath. Then it was deliberately hidden. Then a temple was constructed over it. Or built to protect it, Marcus suggested, his British accent cutting through the humid darkness. Cultures throughout history have done this. Sacred structures built atop older, sometimes forbidden sites. It's not destruction, it's reverence through concealment. Arjun stood and walked to the window, watching the rain assault the palm trees outside. We have to open it, tomorrow, before the rain destabilizes the archway completely. If that landslide had been centimeters deeper, it would have destroyed whatever's in there forever. And if we open it, Rajesh said slowly, we cross a line we cannot uncross. The rain answered for them, drumming harder against the roof, as if the earth itself were trying to convince them of something they didn't yet understand. Chapter 2. Descent. The morning brought a fragile lull in the monsoon. The sky remained bruised and heavy, but the rain paused, a temporary mercy that Swami Ananda interpreted as divine permission. He blessed the chamber's entrance with incense and sacred water, his prayers spoken in Malayalam, old as the stone itself. The temple welcomes seekers of truth, he said to Rajesh, his eyes reflecting something between hope and sorrow. But truth, when exposed to light, often wounds those who find it. The team set up their equipment with meticulous care. Arjun installed LED lighting arrays that cast the stone archway in clinical modern brilliance. Priya documented every inscription with high-resolution photography. Marcus began preliminary documentation of the architectural joints and construction techniques. Rajesh stood at the threshold, mask and headlamp in place, feeling the weight of all the years that had passed since this chamber was sealed. The descent was gentle, a natural slope rather than stairs, the stone worn smooth by deliberate use centuries ago. As they moved deeper, the air shifted, cooler, more still, carrying the mineral tang of undisturbed earth. The walls bore fingerprints of their builders, tool marks from copper or bronze implements, deliberate smoothing at regular intervals, and more inscriptions that made Priya whisper urgently into her recording device. 30 meters in, the passage widened into a chamber. The team's lights swept across stone walls, and suddenly the emptiness hit them. Not the emptiness of an abandoned space, but the emptiness of a deliberately cleared room. The floor was swept clean, the stone polished smooth, and in the center stood what they had come to find, a stone vault, sealed with lead, covered in more script and symbols. The seal is intact, Marcus breathed. Nobody's been in here since it was closed. But someone had been here, Rajesh thought, looking at the arrangement of small stone markers positioned at precise intervals around the vault. These weren't natural formations. This was intentional. This was a system for measuring time or space or significance. These symbols, Priya said, her voice shaking slightly, they're warnings. Look at the repetition, the pattern. This says danger. This says forbidden. And this one, I've only seen this in medieval Tamil temple texts. It means heresy. The word hung in the cool darkness like a curse. Behind them, the passage back to daylight seemed impossibly distant. Above them, the living temple continued its daily rituals, unaware that the foundation of its faith was being interrogated by flashlight and scientific instrument. We need to call Swami Ananda, Arjun said. He needs to see this before we open the vault. But Rajesh was staring at something else. A small clay pot, broken deliberately, its pieces arranged in a specific pattern beside the vault. Inside the largest piece lay a leather document, wrapped in cloth, and a tarnished copper coin bearing an inscription that made his academic heart stop. We need to open it now, he said quietly, before anyone else knows what's here. The rain resumed above them, distant thunder rolling through the temple's stones like a warning. Chapter 3. The First Testimony. The leather document was remarkably preserved. The temple's cool, sealed environment had protected it from decay that would have destroyed paper in centuries. Priya worked with painstaking care, photographing it page by page before Rajesh dared to attempt a translation. The script was Tamil, written in a style that dated roughly to the 8th or 9th century. The author was unknown, but the testimony was explicit. A detailed account of a philosophical dispute between two branches of Hindu practice, one orthodox, one advocating for radical social reform that threatened the temple hierarchy's authority. The author had documented accusations of heresy, the suppression of texts, and most troublingly, the burial of evidence beneath the temple as a symbolic entombment of forbidden ideas. "This isn't just history," Marcus said, reading over Priya's shoulder. "This is a record of intellectual suppression. Someone deliberately wanted to bury these ideas, and the temple's construction over the sealed chamber was part of that erasure." Arjun paced the small chamber, agitated. "We can't release this. Not yet. Do you understand what this means? There are still Brahmin families in this region whose entire authority structure is built on the version of history that says this reform movement never existed." "But it did," Priya said firmly. "And if we suppress this discovery, we become complicit in the same erasure that happened over 1,000 years ago." From deeper in the vault, still sealed, came a sound, a subtle shift in weight. The sound of ancient wood settling as the seal's integrity weakened in response to the air exposure. Above them, the temple's evening bells began to ring, calling the faithful to prayer. The vibration traveled through the stone, and suddenly the chamber felt less like a historical site and more like a place where the past was pressing against the present, demanding acknowledgement. Rajesh thought of Swami Ananda's warning, "Truth wounds those who find it." "We document everything," he decided. "We photograph the vault, we preserve the records, we photograph the architectural signatures. Then we seal this chamber again, and we take our findings to the archaeological authorities in Bangalore. This isn't our decision alone to make. This is a matter of historical integrity that affects entire communities." "They'll bury it again," Marcus said, "more carefully this time." "Perhaps," Rajesh agreed, "but they'll do it knowing that others know the truth. That's different. That's not erasure, that's choice." The copper coin he held bore the same inscription as the vault's seal, Satya Anusandanam, the search for truth. A name, possibly, or a declaration of purpose. As they carefully sealed the chamber and climbed back toward the living temple above, Rajesh understood why Swami Ananda had looked so sorrowful that morning. The priest had known somehow that bringing truth to light would rupture the careful balance between history and faith, between what happened and what people chose to believe happened. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The Resistance. The authorities in Bangalore moved faster than Rajesh anticipated, and in directions he didn't expect. Within 48 hours of his preliminary report, 3 officials arrived at Kailashnath Temple, a state archaeologist, a cultural affairs administrator, and a representative from the temple's governing board. Their expressions ranged from bureaucratic concern to barely concealed alarm. "The chamber will remain sealed, pending further investigation," the administrator announced, in a tone that wasn't really a statement. It was a border being drawn. "Any findings must be cleared through official channels before publication or public disclosure." That's standard protocol," Marcus said carefully, though his eyes betrayed skepticism. "The temple," the board representative added, "has requested that the chamber be permanently resealed." They believe the spiritual integrity of the site has been compromised by archaeological intervention. Arjun and Rajesh exchanged glances. They had prepared for resistance, but not for this particular form. Not the soft power of bureaucratic closure, not the weaponization of spiritual integrity as a reason for historical suppression. Priya, however, saw the real danger. She had worked in Indian archaeology long enough to understand the political currents running beneath this decision. "This is about control," she said that evening, once the officials had departed. "Someone in the government or connected to the government doesn't want this story told. That copper coin, those inscriptions about forbidden reform movements, the evidence of ideological suppression. It threatens narratives that are still politically useful today. We can go public," Marcus suggested, "media, academic journals, international press, and destroy our careers." Rajesh replied, not bitterly, but with the exhausted clarity of someone who understood institutional power. "They'll discredit us as sensation seekers. They'll argue the translations are flawed, the dating is questionable, that we're imposing modern ideological frameworks onto historical evidence. And they'd be partially right. We're all products of our times. But more importantly, they have the resources to make doubt the primary narrative." Arjun stood at the window, watching the temple below, where evening prayers were beginning. "So we do what? Accept this? Let them bury it again?" "No," Rajesh said slowly. "We become more careful. We verify every translation. We have the inscriptions independently examined by 3 separate experts. We document the architectural evidence in ways that are undeniably professional, and we wait for the right moment." "When?" Priya asked. "When silence becomes more suspicious than truth," Rajesh said. That night, a monsoon rains returned with unprecedented violence. The landslide that had exposed the chamber's entrance grew, and alarm bells rang throughout the night as temple workers reinforced the eastern flank. By morning, the archway was buried again beneath several meters of earth and stone, not deliberately this time, but by the same forces that had revealed it. The universe, it seemed, had its own opinions about what should remain hidden. Chapter 5. The Interruption. 3 weeks of enforced separation followed. The team dispersed. Marcus returned to London, Priya took a position documenting temple architecture in Kerala, and Arjun threw himself into structural engineering work that left him exhausted but, he hoped, further from the chamber's implications. Rajesh remained in Bangalore, ostensibly completing his academic obligations, but actually building his documentation network. He contacted colleagues in epigraphy at the University of Madras. He sent photographs of the Tamil inscriptions to a retired professor of medieval history in Pune. He began cross-referencing the copper coins' iconography with numismatic databases maintained by international archaeological institutions. The work was slow, methodical, and, as Priya had warned, increasingly dangerous. The first threat came through university channels, a suggestion that his grant funding might be redirected, that future publication opportunities might depend on more culturally sensitive framing of his research. The second came more directly, a call from a man who identified himself only as interested in historical accuracy, who suggested that Rajesh's family might benefit from a consulting position at a newly established foundation, one that would require him to redirect his research toward more constructive narratives. The third interruption came from an unexpected source. Swami Ananda appeared at Rajesh's apartment in Bangalore, traveling against his age and against the monsoon season, carrying a leather satchel that he placed on Rajesh's table with trembling hands. "I have violated the trust of my order," the priest said, his English careful and formal. "But I have lived 83 years on this earth, and I have learned that some silences are not sacred. They are cowardly. This chamber was sealed not by saints, but by men afraid of what reform movements might threaten their authority. I do not believe this is what the divine intends." Inside the satchel were copies, carefully made, painstakingly photographed, of texts that had been stored in the temple's inner sanctum for centuries. Temple records written by successive priests, acknowledging what lay beneath the temple, acknowledging the seal, acknowledging the deliberate choice to keep the discovery hidden. "This proves intentional suppression," Rajesh said, understanding the enormity of what the old priest had risked. "It proves institutional memory," Swami Ananda corrected gently. "We have always known. We chose not to act, but I choose differently now. My time passes. I choose that truth survives my silence." The rain drummed against the windows as Rajesh photographed each document. By dawn, he had secured copies in 3 separate digital locations and sent encrypted versions to trusted colleagues. By midday, he had made contact with international media outlets and academic institutions. By evening, he received word that 2 officials from Cultural Affairs had requested an informal meeting with him. The interference was becoming direct. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The meeting took place in a government office in Bangalore, all polished wood and institutional paintings of historical figures. The administrator from before sat across from Rajesh with an expression that suggested she was delivering a difficult diagnosis. "Your research is valuable," she began, and Rajesh recognized this as the moment when pressure transforms from suggestion into ultimatum. But the timing of its publication is sensitive. There are ongoing negotiations between the state government and the temple's governing board regarding land rights and heritage classification. A controversy regarding historical suppression could destabilize these negotiations. "What you mean," Rajesh said carefully, "is that you want to delay publication until the political situation is resolved favorably for particular interests." "I mean," she corrected, with the precise diction of someone trained in institutional language, "that archaeology exists within a social context. Your findings have implications beyond historical documentation. They implicate religious institutions, challenge official narratives, and potentially undermine community trust in heritage preservation efforts." "Or," Rajesh countered, "they demonstrate why transparency and honest historical scholarship are essential to maintaining that trust." She opened a folder. Performance reviews he didn't recall having seen before, questions about methodological rigor, suggestions from unnamed colleagues that his work was politically motivated rather than academically rigorous. It was masterful, really. Not a direct threat, but a construction of doubt, a creation of narrative uncertainty about his credibility. "I have documentary evidence," Rajesh said, pushing back with the only weapon he possessed. "I have independent verification of the inscriptions. I have temple records provided by the religious authorities themselves, and I have a responsibility to scholarly integrity that supersedes political convenience." "Then you understand," she said, closing the folder slowly, "that you are choosing a path that may have consequences for your career, your funding, and your institutional affiliations." It was in its way a reasonable threat. Institutional archaeology operated on grants and positions, on publication opportunities and peer recognition. To refuse cooperation with power was to choose marginalization. When Rajesh left that office, he called Marcus in London and Priya in Kochi. He also called Arjun, who drove through the night to reach him. They reconvened at a small university in a different state, one with no direct governmental connections, and a dean with a reputation for protecting academic independence. There, in a single intense weekend, they completed the manuscript, comprehensive, meticulously documented, historically honest. "When do we publish?" Arjun asked. "Simultaneously," Rajesh decided. Academic journals, international media, open access repositories, all at once. That way they can't suppress a single version. The story is already out before they can attempt damage control. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Chapter 7. The Release. The publication hit on a Thursday morning, and the response was immediate and fragmented. International archaeological journals and news outlets ran the story with variations. Hidden texts reveal historical suppression in Indian temple. Medieval reform movement, deliberately erased from official history. Sealed chamber beneath live temple contains evidence of institutional censorship. Within hours, social media exploded into competing narratives. Some celebrated the historical revelation. Others accused the research team of cultural insensitivity and externally imposed interpretations. Still others questioned the dating and translation methodology. The temple issued a statement expressing betrayal at the breach of confidentiality. Though technically, Rajesh had violated only the administrator's request, not any formal legal agreement. Government officials called the research premature and incomplete. Heritage organizations split into factions, some celebrating the transparency, others arguing for slowing publication pending further institutional review. But something else happened too. Scholars from across India, historians, epigraphers, Sanskrit specialists, began examining the evidence independently. They verified the dating, confirmed the script analysis, and began publishing their own papers exploring the broader implications of the documented suppression. The narrative could not be controlled because it had been released into the academic commons. And then Swami Ananda appeared on a national news program, the elderly priest sitting with calm authority and explaining why he had provided the temple's records. Truth is a spiritual practice, he said simply. A religion that requires deception is not worthy of faith. His statement shattered the last barrier of institutional resistance. Other priests began coming forward, sharing their own awareness of the chamber, their own discomfort with the maintained fiction. A movement emerged not against tradition, but for honest reckoning with historical complexity. Rajesh watched the coverage from a small apartment in Kerala, exhausted and exhilarated in measures he couldn't quite separate. Priya sat beside him, noting academic citations and professional opportunities beginning to emerge from the controversy. Marcus had already received 3 book offers. Arjun, working in structural engineering, had been contacted about advising on the proper restoration and documentation of the chamber. "It's not over," Priya said carefully. "There will be counter-narratives, political pressure, attempts to reframe the story." "I know," Rajesh agreed, "but it's in the world now. That's what matters. The suppression itself has been documented. Whatever happens next, the lie has been interrupted." In the temple at Kailashnath, Swami Ananda sat in the cool stone interior, listening to the evening prayers rising from the faithful. The chamber beneath remained sealed, pending proper documentation and conservation. But the seal was no longer absolute. The silence had been broken, and whatever emerged from that rupture would be claimed not by concealment, but by honest investigation and communal choice. Outside, the monsoon rains had ceased, and the dry season was approaching. The earth, which had begun this revelation through flood and landslide, now settled into stability. The cycle of seasons continuing its ancient rhythm. Chapter 8. The After Effect. 6 months later, a formal excavation was authorized, jointly overseen by state archaeologists, international heritage organizations, and a committee of temple representatives that included Swami Ananda. The chamber was properly opened, documented with modern methodology, and the vault was carefully unsealed in the presence of witnesses from multiple disciplines and communities. Inside lay exactly what the medieval author's testimony had suggested. Palm leaf manuscripts detailing reform philosophies, copper coins bearing iconography distinct from official coinage, ritual objects bearing inscriptions that contradicted orthodox theological interpretations, and correspondence between philosophers whose names had been systematically removed from official histories. But more significantly, they found evidence of deliberate erasure. Charred margins, where texts had been burned before burial, deliberately defaced inscriptions, spaces designed to hold materials that had been destroyed. The chamber was not simply a repository of forbidden knowledge, it was an archaeological record of the act of suppression itself. Rajesh, now invited to lead the formal investigation, found himself in the strange position of being vindicated and marginalized simultaneously. Government agencies that had tried to suppress his research now attempted to absorb his work into their own official narrative. Universities that had questioned his methodology now competed for his appointment. The same media outlets that had suggested his findings were culturally insensitive now celebrated him as a defender of heritage transparency. It was, in many ways, a more sophisticated form of control, not preventing him from speaking, but channeling his authority into institutional frameworks that would moderate and dilute the radical implications of his discovery. Arjun recognized this immediately. "They're trying to domesticate the revolution," he said bluntly, reviewing the official proposals for heritage conservation and educational materials. "They'll turn the story into a lesson about institutional resilience rather than a warning about the dangers of ideological suppression." "What else can we do?" Priya asked. "Weary from months of interviews and academic conferences, we released the information. We've been proven right. At some point, the story has to move beyond us." "But it has to move in the right direction," Marcus insisted. He had flown back to India to observe the formal excavation and had become increasingly convinced that the broader implications were being minimized. This isn't just about medieval history, it's about the mechanisms by which power suppresses dissent, erases alternative perspectives, and buries inconvenient truths. That pattern didn't end in the 9th century. Rajesh thought of the administrator who had tried to delay publication, the careful suggestions of institutional consequences, the construction of doubt around his credibility. She was following patterns centuries old, using institutional mechanisms to suppress what she considered dangerous knowledge. "We document it all," he decided. "We publish extensive academic analyses. We create educational materials. We make sure that what happened here, both the original suppression and the attempt to suppress our research, becomes part of the historical record itself." No, the chamber was preserved, documented, and eventually opened to carefully managed public access. Scholars from across the world began citing the discovery, using it to re-examine other instances of historical erasure, other moments when institutions had deliberately buried inconvenient truths. But the most profound change occurred quietly within the temple itself. Swami Ananda began a practice of annual lectures on the suppressed reform philosophies, held in a new wing of the temple dedicated to honest reckoning with history. The temple transformed from a place of institutional concealment into a space where spiritual tradition and historical transparency coexisted, messily, sometimes contradictorily, but authentically. The priest, now 91, told Rajesh during one of his visits, "We thought we were protecting faith by hiding truth. We learned that faith requires truth. The hiding was the heresy." Chapter 9. The Resolution. 2 years after the chamber was opened, a major international heritage conference was held in New Delhi. And the Kailashnath discovery became a focal point for discussing institutional responsibility in archaeology and historical scholarship. Rajesh was invited to present, but he shared the platform equally with Swami Ananda, with independent scholars who had verified the research, and with members of the community affected by these historical narratives. The presentation wasn't triumph, it was complexity. They showed the original suppression, the careful documentation of erasure, the evidence that institutions of all kinds are capable of burying inconvenient truths. They showed their own research journey, the institutional pressure they had faced, the ways they had been cautious and sometimes complicit in the very suppression they ultimately challenged. They showed how long-term change required persistence, documentation, and willingness to endure professional consequences. In the audience sat administrators, government officials, and heritage professionals who had resisted or delayed the full revelation. There was no grand confrontation, no moment of complete vindication. Instead, there was acknowledgement, painful, incremental, that historical transparency matters, that suppression carries costs, and that institutions serve better purposes when they facilitate truth-seeking rather than obstruct it. Arjun had moved on to other projects, but he attended the conference to support his brother. "It's never going to be perfect," he said, sitting with Rajesh on a hotel balcony overlooking Delhi's sprawling architecture. "There will always be people trying to control the narrative. But there will be others resisting that control," Rajesh replied. "That's the real discovery. Not the chamber or the manuscripts or the coins. It's that historical truth emerges through sustained commitment to documentation and integrity, even in the face of institutional power." The copper coin, bearing the inscription Satya Anusandanam, the search for truth, became a symbol for the broader movement toward heritage transparency. Universities began creating research initiatives focused on documented historical suppression. Temples and religious institutions worldwide examined their own archives for buried evidence, choosing to make strategic revelations rather than risk future exposure. The chamber at Kailashnath Temple remained open to scholars and carefully to the public. The sealed vault was preserved as an artifact in itself, not opened further, but documented exactly as it had been found, a physical reminder that history layers itself in rock and silence and institutional choice. Priya eventually completed her comprehensive academic text on medieval philosophical suppression in South Indian temples. Marcus co-authored a volume examining international patterns of institutional archival suppression. Rajesh continued directing the Kailashnath studies, mentoring new generations of archaeologists and historians. But the final legacy wasn't contained in publications or positions. It lived in the stories that emerged, of Swami Ananda's courageous decision to violate institutional secrecy in service of truth, of Rajesh's commitment to transparent scholarship despite professional pressure, of Priya's careful documentation that could not be contradicted, of Arjun's recognition that the architecture of suppression, once visible, could be deliberately dismantled. The chamber beneath Kailashnath Temple had been sealed for over 1,000 years, but it was never truly sealed, only delayed. History, like water, finds its way through cracks in institutional silence. The question was never whether truth would emerge, but who would have the courage to excavate it, document it, and stand before power, insisting on its importance. The monsoon rains continued their ancient rhythm. The temple received its daily prayers. The forbidden chamber, no longer forbidden, became instead a testimony to what happens when seekers refuse to accept that some truths should remain buried. Some legacies live in artifacts. Others live in the courage it takes to unearth them. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.